It's going to be why? I'm asking.
Explain this.
The Fifth Estate. Tonight, money, secrecy, and God.
We become suspicious of people that are carrying a large amount of cash around.
This religious leader receives donations from around the world.
We're not a fly-by-night type church.
But American police believed their laws were being broken and set up a sting.
Why would a church smuggle currency out of the United States? This is not a dictatorship country.
Lyndon McIntyre follows a mysterious multi-million-dollar trail through the U.S. and Canada.
Is legal. Some of it is not. But there are no rules in Canada forcing people to report the movement of so much money. And ever since this summer's worldwide collapse of the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, there have been concerns about how authorities track large transfers of cash. Tonight we'll show you what happened when police tried to investigate the movement of more than $100 million from Canada to Europe. Half of the money happened to be shipped through the Toronto branch of the Bank of Credit and Commerce. Canadian police have been unable to find any criminal connection to the money, but their investigation has led to a first glimpse into a secretive practice, the movement of money in the name of God. Something about large amounts of cash makes people curious about where you got it. People like tax collectors, cops, and customs inspectors. And curiosity got the better of a Canada Customs officer when a Mercedes rolled up to the booth at this crossing on the Washington-British Columbia border, January 9th, 1989. This is a reenactment of the scene.
Are you bringing any gifts up?
No.
You have any alcohol or tobacco in your vehicle?
No.
There was the usual polite exchange. They were from Seattle, going to Vancouver for a few days.
Do you have any goods at all that you'd be leaving in Canada?
No.
Nothing to declare. But on a hunch, the customs officer asked the driver to open the trunk.
Let's have you wait over here, please, sir.
In the tire well, he found a pile of large manila envelopes.
What's in the envelope, sir?
Some money?
How much money is there?
$800,000?
Is that U.S. dollars?
Yeah.
It was actually more than $1 million U.S.
So have you take that, park under the canopy to the right. Take that into an officer, please.
Sure.
It's Canada Customs calling. Yes, I'd like to talk to someone there from the anti-drug profiteering section.
They reported the discovery to the RCMP, who are especially curious about large cash movements. That's one way crooks launder money, smuggle it into another country, then run it through a legitimate bank or business, then bring it back as a loan or a dividend or even a gift. Larry Silzer is with the RCMP Anti-Drug Profiteering Unit in Vancouver. He's an expert at tracking money launderers.
We become suspicious of people that are carrying a large amount of cash around. There are some legitimate reasons to carry large amounts, up to millions of dollars. But if you are avoiding all the filing and you are trying to smuggle money or conceal money in that, right away it alerts the police.
This is Sadruddin Kabani, the man with the $1 million in his tire well. He's a software salesman from Washington State. He had several explanations for his unusual cargo. None rang true. If the authorities were surprised to find $1 million in the trunk of a car, it was nothing like the surprising discovery that nobody seemed to own it. First, Kabani said it belonged to a friend of his from Kenya. That turned out to be false. Then a California businessman said it was his. That claim has gone nowhere. So almost 3 years later, the money sits on the books of the BC treasurer while lawyers try to figure out who it really belongs to. A criminal, a Californian, or God. Sadruddin Kabani's lawyer says it really belongs to this man, the Aga Khan. Kabani is an Ismaili Muslim. For Ismailis, Aga Khan is God's man on earth. Most North American Ismailis came from East Africa. They've prospered here, and in 1984, they opened a splendid mosque in Vancouver to thank the Lord and the Aga Khan and Brian Mulroney. Through their mosques, the Ismailis make generous contributions to their leader. In their religious tradition, the offerings are collected anonymously and shipped to his bank in Geneva. Al-Hassam was born an Ismaili in Uganda. He now lives in the United States.
We have a tradition. It's a very simple tradition. Give unto Caesar what's Caesar's and give unto God what's God's. And that's very simple. You can give a tithe, which may be 1/10 of your income, or 1/8 or 1/4. It's not compulsory at all.
And there's another tradition, the tradition of secrecy. It was perfected in places like Uganda. In 1972, the entire Ismaili community had to flee persecution by the then Lord and Master of Uganda, Idi Amin Dada. That meant smuggling their money out, then fleeing themselves. But in the United States, there are rules that forbid large and secret money movements, rules that some Ismailis didn't think should apply to them. Yasmin Alibi lives in Dallas.
But historically, we have never had to tell anyone as to how much or where or why or when this money was being carried overseas. We never had to do that. And we're not a fly-by-night type church. We have a history of 1,400 years of doing the very same thing.
The Aga Khan seems to use the money well. The donations of ordinary Ismailis support hospitals and schools in poor countries all over the world. But recently there have been questions raised about the secret system by which they got their donations to His Highness, and about a key person in that system, Tajuddin Kurji of Vancouver, until 1990 chairman of the Aga Khan Foundation of Canada. In fact, the $1 million intercepted at the BC border by the alert customs official was destined for Mr. Kurji. We'll never know for sure what he planned to do with it. We do know that Mr. Kurji was a key man in a vast network. The Aga Khan as leader was at the head. Just steps beneath him was Taj Kurji. He had a bank account in Switzerland at the Banque Multicommerciale, Geneva. It was a giant collection basket for donations from around the world. Vancouver, New York, Nairobi, Karachi. Donations collected in the Ismaili mosques, usually hand-carried for deposit to a Kurji account, then transferred to the Aga Khan's account at Lloyd's Bank in Geneva. Mr. Kurji didn't physically transport the money himself. He used trusted couriers. Taj Ismail is the director of his Vancouver company, Tajiko. Taj Ismail did a lot of business at this bank, the Toronto branch of the Bank of Credit and Commerce. Between 1980 and 1988, he deposited $65 million in cash here for transfer through the Royal Bank to Switzerland, to Mr. Kurji's account there. In the States, another courier, Nizam Alibi, Mr. Kurji's brother-in-law, often hand-carried money to Europe himself, taking time off from running a factory Mr. Kurji owned in Dallas. The factory eventually went bankrupt. Nizam was a frequent flyer out of Dallas, but while he was passing through London, British customs officers discovered he was often carrying large amounts of cash. He told them it was from a coffee business. They let him through, but they tipped off their American counterparts. The Internal Revenue Service put Nizam under video surveillance. At that point, they didn't know about the secret system for shipping tithe money. In any case, it's illegal in the U.S. to take any kind of money over $10,000 out of the country without reporting it. In Canada, there's no such reporting law.
Over here is a collection of surveillance photos that I had enlarged.
Scott Marshall, an eager beaver agent for the U.S. Internal Revenue Service, entered the picture and directed the surveillance of Nizam Alibi.
We obviously knew that from our initial investigation that Nizam Alibi was not a coffee dealer, and that they were somehow disguising actually smuggling, physically smuggling the money. We have suspicions it could be money for income taxes. That kind of volume could also be related to drugs.
Eventually, the IRS heard about the secret Ismaili system for moving religious money. But they didn't believe that was the case here. And for Marshall, anybody smuggling bags of cash containing millions of dollars is up to no good.
Why would a church smuggle currency out of the United States? This is not a dictatorship country or something like that where they'd feel that their money was in jeopardy or that type of thing. So, no, that would not actually change the illegality of it.
Marshall decided to set up a sting, but he knew he'd need help from inside the Ismaili community. Enter Al Hassam, who'd complained to the IRS about an unrelated shady deal involving his uncles. Marshall asked him to try to tempt Nizam with a money laundering scheme.
I did exactly as what I was requested by the government to say. I knew it was a sting operation.
And he knew he was setting up some old friends for a bad fall.
It was not an easy decision to make. But if somebody's going into the business of laundering money and is breaking the law of the country, that is wrong.
Al Hassam would meet Nizam in a hotel room where the IRS had installed a camera in a television set. Hassam, or an undercover agent, would give Nizam packets of money, ask him to send it out of the country, and then transfer it back to phony companies in the U.S. Nizam would get a 5% commission. It was standard money laundering procedure, and Nizam seemed to know the ropes. And the sting wasn't just for Nizam Alibi. In a comfortable Dallas suburb, Hassam found another willing money launderer.
Did you jog this morning?
Yes, I did.
Sultan Alibi, no relation to Nizam, was a businessman. Yasmin, his wife, and he are Canadians, though they've lived in Dallas for the past 12 years. The IRS traced some of Nizam Alibi's money to a bank where Sultan Alibi had numerous accounts. So the agent, Al Hassam, approached him with a money laundering deal. Sultan is a devoted follower of the Ismaili Imam, the Aga Khan. Al Hassam is too. So if Al wanted them to launder money, well, he was like family.
You have to remember that Mr. Hassam has known my husband for over 20 years. We're not talking about strangers. That's number one. Number two is the fact that we all belong to the same faith, and it's very, very uncommon for people in our faith to stab each other in the back. That's just never happened.
Usually, Sultan, Yasmin, or a courier would travel to Brussels with the money, but 3 of their 12 trips were to Canada, to the Toronto Currency Exchange on Yonge Street.
There's a perception that Toronto, Canada is becoming a place where it's easy to send money abroad. There are no questions asked. Was that your impression?
No, I don't think so. In Europe, it's easy too. You can take money anywhere in Europe and they don't ask you where the money is coming from.
Well, why go to Toronto?
Because it was nearer, that's why.
I had a big meeting with them last.
It was all so easy, Sultan soon had laundered $1.5 million. So the IRS asked him to get into the big time. They said they wanted to move money for a South American drug cartel. They already had him for illegal currency exports, but they decided to go for maximum burn.
But I'm looking at trying to move through you maybe within a 1 month period of time, somewhere between $6 and $7 million. I don't know if you can handle that. Well, you can't handle that long. How about your...
Less than a month after that meeting, Sultan and his wife and 11 others, including Nizam Alibi, were arrested. 7 were Canadians. All either pled guilty or were convicted of offenses ranging from simple currency violations to money laundering. Nizam Alibi is now serving a 7-year prison sentence.
Justice.
The arrests stunned the Ismaili community in North America, especially the ones that were caught.
I don't feel like this sting operation has helped the drug business at all or the money laundering business at all. It's still being out there in the streets. They caught the wrong guys. We were not involved in any criminal behavior before.
Yasmin Alibi got 2.5 years, and her husband Sultan 11 years for their roles in the sting. The leg bracelet keeps track of Sultan's movements as they await the inevitable start of their prison terms. Under U.S. law, they must serve at least 85% of their sentences. The informer, Al Hassam, doesn't feel sorry for any of them.
This was not a case against the Ismaili people. These were a few people amongst our faith or our society who were conducting themselves in illegal activities. They got caught red-handed.
One of the people they caught red-handed that day was Sadruddin Kabani, the man Canadian Customs nabbed at the BC border 6 months earlier in January 1989. Kabani was another Ismaili courier, but he hadn't actually handled any of the IRS sting money. As for that $1 million in the trunk of his car, a judge believed it was religious tithing money and let him off lightly. The IRS remains skeptical, and here's why.
The journey began back in the morning.
While watching Nizam Alibi's money couriers in the investigation that led to the sting, they followed this man to Kabani's hometown, Seattle.
He gets off this plane and gets into a sitting area at the front of the airport.
He's about to receive $400,000 in a shopping bag at New York's LaGuardia Airport. The money would zigzag across the United States to Kabani's doorstep.
It's amazing here that it's $500,000 and he just leaves the bag in New York City. That's a big no-no. We're in about noon in Dallas when he arrives back in Dallas. He immediately gets on another aircraft to Seattle, Washington. We're talking still all in the same day.
Dallas to New York, New York to Dallas, and Dallas to Seattle.
Right, which is quite a trip.
That's a long day. When Kabani got the $400,000, he in turn handed it off to another courier, a Canadian who headed north to Vancouver.
Once you cross that border with that currency and non-detected, you're home free. Because literally there is no reporting law when you go to a Canadian bank and deposit that.
The $1 million Kabani later tried to carry to Canada himself was presumably bound for the same pipeline to Europe. In July '88, Taj Ismail had hired Brinks Canada to transfer large amounts of money from Canada to Switzerland. Remember, Taj Ismail is the courier who hand-carried $65 million in cash to Toronto between 1980 and 1988. In mid-1988, they started using Brinks. Between July 1988 and May 1989, they moved large amounts of cash to Geneva for Taj Ismail. They carefully recorded the transactions. July 7th, '88, $850,000. July 26th, '88, $1.4 million. August 10th, '88, $1.4 million. In all, $51.3 million in less than a year, and Brinks reported it to the RCMP. It seemed like such a lot of money. We decided to ask where it came from. We called on the people who should have known, Taj Ismail and his boss, Taj Kurji. Is Mr. Ismail in?
No, he's not here.
And here's Mr. Kurji in?
Mr. Kurji's not here.
Nothing sinister about. And then we went to Ismail's home in the exclusive British Properties neighborhood in Vancouver.
He's not here, so I don't know where he is.
Okay, well...
Okay? And I think that you've been told that he doesn't want...
Well, no, we haven't been told anything. We've been asking all over for him, and people just simply tell us that he's not around.
He's not around then. He's disappeared off the face of the earth, I guess. I don't know.
Well, that's a shame. Taj Kurji seems to have disappeared off the face of the earth, too. We requested an interview through his lawyer months ago, went to his office and his home, but haven't been able to find him. We were anxious to talk to him because at the time his people were moving large amounts of money out of Canada. Members of their community were being investigated for money laundering in the U.S. Between 1980 and 1989, Mr. Kurji's agent, Taj Ismail, shipped over $116 million out of Canada, more than half of it through this now-defunct bank, a bank whose international parent has been accused of money laundering on a massive scale. That's what the $1 million found in the trunk of a car at the BC border. Nobody knows where all that money came from and may well never know. But the case of the mysterious Ismaili bagmen revealed a dramatic contrast in how Canada and the United States view the growing problem of money laundering. As soon as the Americans saw the suspicious movements of cash, they assumed the worst and lowered the boom. People went to jail. The Canadian reaction was remarkably different.
This is how they busted...
Michael McKenzie is the superintendent of financial institutions, the man responsible for the stability of the banking system.
All we saw were a bunch of heavy deposits that looked pretty unusual and turned them over. I mean, it wasn't, I don't see that I'm competent to judge whether this is good money, bad money, hot money, or cold money.
You turned them over to the police?
Yeah.
And that ended it for you?
Sure.
Subject of a charge.
This RCMP officer told a parliamentary committee looking into the collapse of the Bank of Credit and Commerce that there had been an investigation into the Ismaili money movement, but they couldn't trace the Ismaili money to a criminal source and gave up. Committee members also heard from an ex-Mountie who worked on the investigation. He said it was understaffed and that the police were overwhelmed by the scope and complexity of the case. Lawyers for the Ismaili community sent us a letter saying they now comply with U.S. law on currency reporting and always met the letter of Canadian law. In fact, assuming the cash they shipped out of Canada was not from criminal activity, there was no Canadian law to worry about. The issue is, should Canada have laws to control the movement of anonymous cash in and out of the country? Law enforcement officers say we should, to deter money laundering, a problem that is serious and getting worse. Larry Silzer of the RCMP.
The more pressure that they put on that balloon down in the United States, it comes up into Canada, it swells up here. So if we don't have some regulations, some legislation restricting the movement of money or the reporting of currency movement, we're going to see a lot of drug money or criminal money up in Canada.
Canadian banks are committed to aggressive and sophisticated...
There is some evidence that the chartered banks are now voluntarily scrutinizing large cash transactions to make life a bit more challenging for money launderers.
The goal of the banks is to stop money laundering at the front door, and the main weapon is to know your customer.
But still, the first line of defense against the rising tide of dirty money is at the border, a rather porous barrier which, as every school child learns to boast, is the longest undefended border in the world.
If he's not detected...
Murray Neighbors of the IRS.
Our enforcement efforts can only stop at the border, and if they penetrate and escape our enforcement efforts and move to an area that's more lax in its enforcement, so it doesn't have the laws that attract that type of activity, then that does frustrate us in law enforcement in the U.S.
Michael McKenzie, Canada's Superintendent of Financial Institutions.
You don't lay awake at night worrying about money laundering then?
Not particularly, no. I've got other things I do lay awake worrying about.